In 1995, I went to a conference in Australia, and I happened to pop in on a lecture about the Corowa Trek, which is a Anglican girls' school in Melbourne, and they did a 5-week exercise, and I was absolutely fascinated by it. And when I came back to Somerset West, I was sitting on the veranda of the manor house one afternoon, and I looked at those mountains and I thought, well, why can't we do that too? In 1998, we decided to run a couple of test drives. We took various sections of the trek that we thought might be a little bit difficult, and we had 2-day mini treks. We took various classes, and they test drove those routes just to see if they worked. And then I gave Richard a month off school and sent him off into the hinterland, which was quite daunting because he was a young Englishman with no Afrikaans, and he had to go and negotiate with a whole lot of farmers and officials to get permission to cross land, especially a lot of negotiations to get through the nature conservation areas.
So I'm given this sheet of A4 paper, the name of a few towns on it that, well, I haven't heard of and can't pronounce half of them, and Dave just says, go and sort it out.
Eventually, it looked like we could make it work.
So it was basically a journey of getting the grade 7s, the standard 9s then, from Somerset College originally to Cape Agulhas, southernmost tip of Africa, to get that romantic feeling. Where to start?
And so the next thing that we had to do was to persuade the whole staff to buy into this, because it had to be a whole school event. And I was fortunate. I had the most unbelievably good staff, and they just said, right, let's go. And so we did.
Arbor Day, I think it was, in '98, Dave and I go out in his old jalopy, and we drive from here up over Sir Iris Pass to Tivodderscliff, and we cut up a farm track up over a mountain, and we come down the other side. I've got a map which has no bearing on where we are at all until we find a prison. And we find the prison, we've popped over the other side of the hill, and then we find another little road, and we end up in Genadendal and then Greyton. And that was a huge victory, because we knew we could get from here to Greyton. From Greyton it was easy then to get over the mountain to McGregor, and then that was a different kettle of fish completely.
The first trek took place in February of 1999, and I seem to remember it consisted of 6 groups, each group of about 12 to 14, each accompanied by 2 adults.
So in those days we went from the college to Blauwklippen. Graham Boonzar owned Blauwklippen then, as he was one of the board members, so we stayed there. And then across the mountains at the back of the university and up into the Yongasuk Valley. And day 3 was the children waking up and seeing the mountains ahead of them in the clouds, and knowing that that night they would be sleeping on the top. And that campsite at the top, it was a flat grassy area, and they cooked supper, and then you could go to the edge and look over Somerset West and see the sun setting, and that was your last glimpse of home and sort of civilization. And the following morning you turned your back on that and off you go.
But that was the start. Before that, we had to persuade the parents. The parents, understandably, had a lot of questions, and I remember that meeting that we had in the hall. It must have lasted 3.5 hours.
But the support all the way through was phenomenal from the parents, and the trust they had in me and the school to actually do the whole thing was immense. Things like food, how were they going to get fed? What would happen if there was an accident or an emergency? How are we going to deal with that? A felt fire, how are we going to deal with that if we came across that on the route? Dehydration, snakes.
You name it, they asked it. But eventually, I think it was all but 2 of those first year kids actually went on the trek.
We dished out these letters. It was to a group of boys, and the silence and the emotion of 14, 15-year-old boys reading handwritten letters from their parents. It was an extremely special moment, and there's photos of just sheer emotion as the children read this. And I know that lots of parents have kept those letters that came back, and no doubt they'll get reread at weddings and 21sts and all sorts of things.
The first trek I remember very clearly. One of the groups lost its way, and they'd radioed in at about midday to say they would reach their objective. And when we looked on the map and what they saw around them, we realized they'd gone the wrong way, and they had to go all the way down again and up the other side. And ultimately, they only got in at 8 o'clock at night, and they were girls accompanied by 2 teachers who were understandably nervous, frightened. But fortunately, we had backup, and we had Mountain Club backup all the way, and they sent 2 people up there to pick them up and take them to the top. It's a huge responsibility, and one of the requirements that I made right at the start was that Richard Codrington had to phone me every single evening. It didn't matter how late he phoned, but I had to know that every single group was at where they were supposed to be, or if they weren't, that they were at least safe. And that went on for 28 days. But the excitement that we had when ultimately he called me and he just said the last group of the last day were in, and the whole thing had worked and nobody had got hurt. It was the most indescribable feeling of triumph, really. We'd all reached the objective that we'd set.
Hi guys, this is Ted speaking from the beach at the headmaster reserve. There is a protest flag flying from Protea on top of the beach. All kids have made it, all adults have made it. We've done it. They're here, they're safe, and the blue flag, the blue zebra flag is flapping in the breeze. The sun is about to set. It's magic.
It really is a wonderful concept, and it's not about just an endurance trip. It's about personal growth, and I have seen so many incredible changes in young people as a result of doing that trek. And I think that when you meet the young adults, and as I have 10 years after they've left school, and they are just thoroughly nice people, I like to think that the fact that they had to go through this experience actually contributed quite a lot to who they are later on in life.